Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Spiritual Cake Podcast. We talk about anything and everything that has to do with the spiritual side of our existence. You're familiar with the physical and the mental and the emotional, but we have been discussing the spiritual, whatever that is. My name is Clint Houghton. With me is Wendy Dahl. Wendy.
Hi, Clint.
Hello, Wendy. If you're joining us for the first time, you should know that neither Wendy nor I run any kind of a religious organization, nor has our formal education been along those lines. We were both raised relatively conservative Christian. Wendy is Mormon. I was raised Lutheran, but have since explored a lot of different philosophies and theologies. Plus, we are both in the event industry with an international clientele. And that has exposed us to a lot of different cultures and rituals and traditions. And we bring all of that into this conversation. And that's exactly what it is. It's a conversation. And if you want to join the conversation, then at the end of this episode, we will tell you how to do that. Wendy, every time I come to talk to you in our podcast, there's always something that kind of triggered my imagination or my curiosity. And today is no exception. The concept of church became interesting to me. When something is so familiar, sometimes it loses its meaning. We don't see the depth of it, like church, and then there's a simple concept. And so, like, for instance, when I say church, what comes to mind?
Going to church on Sundays.
The services.
Hmm.
When I think of church, the first thing that comes into my head is a building. I don't know why. I guess maybe because I grew up with that, where we went to church. And right now I can picture the church that I grew up in because it was a big part of my life for my entire childhood, all the way up until when I went to college. I was so immersed in that culture that most of my friends were not at school. Most of my friends were at church. Every single facet, every single inch of that property was extremely familiar to me. I realize, though, that when I think of church, I think of a building. Like right now, I can think of synagogues. I can think of, what do you call it, the Muslim or the Nation of Islam, where they hold their services?
Mosque.
A mosque. There you go. Thank you very much. Different places of worship like that. And to me, they kind of all fall under the umbrella of church. What do you think of that?
Sure.
So then I thought, okay, let me just figure out what church actually is, because the first thing that jumped into your mind was going to church. And the first thing that jumped in my mind is where you went, the building. So
Right.
I thought, why don't we ask the third member of our podcast, which is ChatGPT? Okay, so the first thing I asked was define church, because we have to start somewhere. It's the people, it's the institution, and it's the building. So we're both right. What's interesting to me is how people will define things and what they hold on to in terms of what's important to them. We've already identified that you and I were both raised relatively conservative Christian. In many Christian traditions, the word emphasizes the people more than the building. I never even thought of that. That's so weird how my mind works. I never thought of the actual services when I think of church. I do remember a lot of people saying using church as a verb, like we're going to church it up or we're going to Sunday go to meeting close. Okay, so the people, a group of believers who gather for worship, teaching, and community. See, that's another thing that's interesting. The worship is the most obvious thing, which would be the services. The teaching, I guess, built into the services, but not necessarily. I mean, you can have Bible studies or other things that are similar to that, but then also the community, which you and I have talked about a lot in regard to the congregation and the people that make up the congregation, and then the institution, an organized religious body with leadership, traditions, and doctrines. And you're immersed in that with the Mormon culture. Would you agree with that?
Yeah.
And I like when you describe, the hierarchy and how everything is kind of segmented in regards to responsibilities. And I like that a lot. The church that I grew up in, there was definitely a structure. It was a Lutheran church and it belonged to a synod, Synod. And I don't know why they gave it that name. At some point, I'll probably look that up. There was an overseeing organization based out of Missouri, and there were different types of Lutherans, the Missouri Synod, the American Synod, and so on. And so we had a higher structure. And then obviously the clergy of our church, the pastor, he's the one that kind of ran the church, but they also had elders that were members of the church, typically, the older men, that they would pick some of those and they would run the policy of the church. They were the one that set up the tithing. I don't know what
Hmm.
they do in the Mormon church, but in the Christian church, we don't have a set donation that we give. The donations are completely voluntary and whatever amount you are going to give, and it's done during the service where they have these plates and everything stops and the ushers come around and pass the plate, and then people would put money or checks or whatever it is into the plate. Does that sound familiar? Do you guys do that in the Mormon church?
We don't do that in the Mormon church, but I remember going to a Lutheran church when I was a teenager and seeing that. So I'm very familiar with what you're describing. In our church, it used to be, before everything could be digital, there were these little envelopes and a little form, and you would put your money inside of that envelope, fill out the form, and give it to a member of leadership. In our case, they call it the bishopric. It is suggested that you give 10% of your gain to the church. So that's kind of how it works for us. And it
Yeah,
wasn't something that you did in front of other people. You just sort of did it. Like I remember my parents being kind of secretive about it, which I thought was interesting.
secretive. That's interesting.
Yeah, like they didn't want anyone to know. And I
But
was like,
do they
why
hand it
would you?
specifically to a bishop? I mean, it's like a here, take my envelope to a person.
Yeah, you would give it to the bishop, or the bishop has two counselors, so you would give it to one of the three of them.
Like when you would go to church, and then
Yeah, just at some point while you were at church.
was it a weekly thing or was it broken up into different
No,
segments?
well, I guess you could pay however often you wanted. You could have done it once a month or once a quarter or once a year or once a
You
week.
know that 10% thing? I think that's kind of across the Christian culture. I think the
Hmm.
10% thing. Is there some Bible passage that says 10%? I don't know. We'll look that up in a. And then the elders would, I remember my dad after the church service would be in one of those classrooms and they would count the money. But once a year, they would have a tithing. Tithing is spelled Tithing,
Hmm.
tithe, Tithe.
Hmm.
So it's the giving. They would have a service where people would write down what they thought they would be able to give in the next calendar year. And I don't know if they wrote down a dollar amount. I don't know if probably a dollar amount because the whole budget of the church was based on what they thought was going to be coming in from the congregation. Does that sound familiar?
Sure.
My wife is Jewish. She didn't grow up belonging to a synagogue, but it's my understanding, based on the Jewish friends that I've got, they don't do the whole guesswork thing. If you want to belong to a synagogue, then it's going to cost X amount of money. They figure out the payment system, but it's all purely financial from that standpoint. And I kind of like the clarity of that. I mean, I like the idea that giving is whatever you think you can give, but I also like the, okay, here's our organization and here's what it costs to belong to our organization and have access to everything the organization offers. What do you think of that, of just a straight financial transaction?
I actually prefer that for
Oh,
myself just because it's simple. But I mean, I understand the 10% thing because everybody's at a different financial level. So if, let's say, if somebody has less financial means or lower financial means and they can't afford that flat rate, then they can still come. But I think for me, for simplicity's sake, I prefer that. I actually wish taxes were that way, where it was like, here's the amount you owe. And that's it, and it's none of this guessing and write-offs and all of the sliding scale. And I just, oh my gosh, it's just, can you just
is
simplify
that what they
that? I
call
think
the
we talked
flat
about,
tax?
or just like a transparent one tax, Yeah, I guess it would be a flat tax, kind of like how sales tax is, where you just, that if you're in a certain city in a certain state, this is the tax percentage. That to me makes more sense than this whole thing of, oh yeah, you're in this tax bracket, but you end up giving the government over half of what you make, even though you're in this tax bracket. And it's like, make that make sense?
Yeah, I would like it all to be flat and no
Yeah.
deductions or any of that kind of stuff. Just let's just this is what it is and bing bang boom.
Yeah.
But say la
Right.
vie. Here's something that kind of crosses over, not necessarily spiritual, depending on how you interpret it, but a mystical thing. You know the motivational speaker Anthony Robbins, Tony Robbins?
Yes.
So, okay, so I heard him say, whatever you make, give away 10% of it. Now, he didn't attach it to any kind of a religious organization or anything like that. He just said, if you give away 10% and hopefully to people that need it in some fashion, then for some reason the universe responds to that and you'll actually make more money. You ever heard that?
I have. In fact, I saw this cute video and I didn't save it, but there was a gentleman on one of the social media channels and he was talking about how he and his wife were in like over $200,000 worth of debt and their goal was to pay off
Wow.
100,000 this year. And so he just started documenting his journey where he was saying, hey, it's January, whatever the date was, and I sold my truck. And so I'm going to be riding my bike to school or to work, and this is how much debt we paid off. And then I guess somebody donated him some money. I don't know if it was a GoFundMe or how that worked, but he actually said in how he was planning on using that money that he was going to take $1,000 of it to give to other people who needed money. And I thought, well, isn't that interesting? I love that. Ties it back to that principle of reciprocity or
Oh,
abundance where, you're helping other people and it returns to you. It's kind of like, I talk about this in my little happiness book. The person who is helping or creating happiness for somebody else or with somebody else feels just as happy. as the other person does because it's that exchange of emotion. And I feel like that whole energetic level of how we live also applies to money.
It makes sense to me. I don't understand how it works in the universe where, if you give, then it comes back. But I think there scriptures that if you give, it'll come back to you tenfold. Isn't there
Mhm.
something like that?
Oh, I'm sure there is.
It's interesting. And I like it. Even if you don't get anything back, I'm also writing a book called We Are Ones. We're all similar, but we're all different. And that whole concept fascinates me. So the way we're all similar is the fact that as a species, we're tribal. So it's built into us to help people and feel useful. And I guess the dopamine, serotonin, whatever those chemicals are released when you help somebody or feel
Yep.
like you're helpful and that sort of thing. And so
Yes.
even if it's just giving money, I think that's why some people will donate without real deep research into where is this money going because it just feels good to donate. You feel like a good person or whatever that is. Anyway, all right. So that's part of the financial part of a church is a real thing. Now, if the church, this is interesting because the church doesn't have to be a brick and mortar because the building is a physical place where religious services and activities take place. All right. So how does one create a church? Now, the thing I like about this is that they're not saying that a church has to be a specific physical entity in terms of brick and mortar or place or whatever. There just has to be a gathering spot where people come together to share belief systems or spiritual vision or whatever the case may be. That's all that is apparently needed in order to create a church. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I knew a guy that was a pastor at a church. They didn't have their own building. So once a week, they would go into somebody else's space and they would have services. You would think, well, that could be a little dicey because what if something happens to that space? And that's what happened to him. He lost his congregation because he lost his place of worship, his meeting place. But I have gone to Bible studies in people's homes, other spiritual gatherings. This is where the word church can take on so many meanings because if I feel uplifted or I feel that spiritual connection, then wherever I am is my church. Does that make sense?
Yes, and I have a cute story about that actually. Caitlin and I had to go to San Luis Obispo. Caitlin's my daughter.
Okay.
We had to drive up there one day for a 1 hour meeting. So it's a 4 hour drive on each side, but it was a 1 hour meeting. And so on the way back, and it's beautiful. The drive on the 101 through Central Coast, California is just, it's beautiful. And to be honest, I don't recall ever driving past Santa Barbara. So I kept saying, look at that, look at that. So on the way back, it took us like up in the hills through Solvang and like around the 101. So there must have been an accident. And I remember saying to her, because we were up in the forest, and I was like, don't you feel closer to God right now? And she goes, actually, I was gonna say the same thing. Isn't that interesting how we could have pulled off on the side of the road and had a little service, even if it wasn't formal, and feel like it was the same feeling that you feel when you go to a church building. You're just out in nature and enjoying it. And so yeah, so it's interesting that you mentioned that because I feel like church isn't necessarily bound to a building. It could be anywhere.
I agree. Now I remember what triggered this whole curiosity about the word church. I'm walking to a park. I get out of my car, get to the edge of the parking lot, and there's these two young ladies who are walking towards me, and they're wearing little ID badges. And they say, "Hi, we want to invite you to our church." Now, my first thought is that they're Latter-day Saint people. But no, I looked at it and it was just the Church of Jesus Christ. It's interesting. I've never seen that before I've seen Jehovah's Witness who will walk around and tell people to try this, but to have this approach, and they were so nice and so happy. And I said, "Oh, where's your church?" And they said where it was. And I said, "Oh, yeah, I know. Would you like to come to service with us?" And I said, "Oh, no, thanks. I've got my own church, but good luck." And when I said that, it reaffirmed what I truly believe is I am my own church. That moment that you shared with your daughter in the car, because of the way we're programmed as tribal people, that sense of community, even if it's just the two of you who feel a spiritual connection to something, now all of a sudden you're sharing that connection and the experience. It takes on a different meaning. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
I think it's one of the beautiful things that we're programmed with is that feeling of somehow it gets a little stronger. You and I have talked about when we walk into a place of worship, for whatever reason, it feels different. And I just think that the vibes of the people during the church services or whatever they feel when they walk into that space permeates the space. And so when you walk in, you're going to pick up on whatever that vibe is, even if it's not actually happening at that moment. It still feels like it's part of the space. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
And there have been times where I've had a connection with somebody, either they want to share something with me or we have something in common that would cross over into spirituality. And at that specific moment, there is something greater than us at that moment. There's like a connection to whatever this thing is that seems to be built in us. We're almost out of time, but have you ever seen people that are Hindus and they'll greet people with their hands like this?
Yes.
When
All
I
the
went to,
time, actually, since I do South Asian weddings.
yes, okay, there you go.
Yes.
Do you know what that means when they do that?
No, actually. I just thought it was like a reverent
Oh, it
hello.
is. It is. But it's very specific the way it was described to me because I was in a yoga center for 8 years and most of them really identified with Hinduism and Buddhism and that sort of thing. Well, the way it was described to me is that when you do this, and you can bow or whatever, but when you do this, you're acknowledging the divine in the other person, that you're honoring the divine in the other person. It all comes as one package. You're honoring the person, but you're also honoring the divine that sits inside each of us. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so I find myself, it's just part of who I am now. When people say goodbye, I do this. I don't consciously think I'm honoring the divine inside you, but it just seems like it's a part of my energy and what I do. And I'm not going to let go of that because I just like the way it feels.
Oh, I love that.
Thank you. All
So
right,
nice.
Wendy, tell everybody how they get in touch with us.
You can find us on spiritualcake.com where you can go back and listen to or read any of our previous episodes. You can click one of the two social media icons and join us on Facebook or Instagram, or you can send us an email requesting a topic or even to join the conversation.
Absolutely. And when you do join the conversation, please know we welcome you with open arms. That's it for this episode of the Spiritual Cake Podcast. This is Clint, and on behalf of Wendy, we will see you next time.